The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I could see the sun out of one or two holes, but mostly it was big trees all about and gloomy in there amongst them. I was powerful lazy and comfortable. Didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hears the sound of a boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbows and listens. Pretty soon, I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at the hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke lying on the water a long ways up, about abreast the ferry, and there was the ferry boat full of people floating along down. I knowed what the matter was now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry's boat side. You see, they were firing cane over the water trying to make my carcass come to top. I was pretty hungry, but it weren't going to do for me to start a fire because they might see the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looked pretty on a summer morning. So I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go to the drowned carcass and stop there. So I says, I'll keep a lookout, and if there's any of them floating around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois' edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I weren't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I most got it with the long stick, but my foot slipped and she floated out further. Of course I was where the current set in close to the shore. I'd known enough for that, but by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver, and set my teeth in it. It was baker's bread. What a quality eat, none of your low-down corn pone. Got a good place amongst the leaves and sat there on a log, munching the bread and watching the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt but there is something in that thing. That is, there's something in it when a body like the widow or the parson prays. But it don't work for me, and I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke and went on watching. The ferry boat was floating with the current, and I allowed to have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along because she would come in close, where the bread did. When she got pretty well along down towards me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread, and laid down behind a log in the bank in a little open place where the log forked. I could peep through. By and by she come along, she drifted in so close they could run out a plank and walk ashore. Most everybody was on the boat, Pap, Judge Thatcher, and Bessie Thatcher, and Joe Harper, and Tom Sawyer, and his old Aunt Polly, and Sid and Mary, and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side under stream, and booming once in a while as they went, I crossed over to the other side and watched them. When they got abreast ahead of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of a tent of my blankets to put my things under, so the rain couldn't get them. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. By and by I got sort of lonesome, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the current swashing along and counted the stars and drifting logs, and the rafts came down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you're lonesome. Can't stay so, you soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing, but the next day I went exploring around through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it, but mainly I wanted to put time in it. I found plenty strawberries ripe and prime, and green summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries were just beginning to show. They would all come in handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. Had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection. Thought I would kill some game to home. About this time, I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off the grass and the flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden, I bounded right on the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for it to look further. but I cocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as I ever could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further and then listened again, and so on and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breasts in two, and I only got half, and the short half too. When I got to camp, I weren't feeling very brash. There weren't much sand in my craw, but I says this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps in my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing, I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods, and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night, I was pretty hungry. So when it was getting dark, I slid out from ashore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank, about a quarter of a mile. I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I would stay there all night when I hear a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses coming, and next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could, and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say,
"Better camp here if we can't find a good place. The horses, it's about beat out. Let's look around."
I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't, somehow, for thinking, and every time I waked up I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm a-going to find out who it is that's on the island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down there amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadow, it made I poked along well into an hour, and everything still was rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripple of cool breeze begins to blow, and that was good as saying the night was about to be done. I gave her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to the shore. Saying the night was about done, I gave her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to a shore. And then I got my gun and slipped out into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the treetops and known the day was coming. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across the campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I had no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place, but by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of a fire away from the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most gave me the phantoids. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes and about 6 foot of me, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gaped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket. It was Mrs. Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says,
"Hello, Jim."
He bounced up to me and stared at me wild. Then he drops down to his knees and puts his hands together and says,
"Don't hurt me, don't. I ain't never done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people, and I done all I could for 'em. You go and get in the river again, where you belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim, who always go and get in the river again, where you belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim, and always your friend."
Well, I weren't long making him understand I weren't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I weren't lonesome now. I told him I weren't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then I says,
"Let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good. You are making up the campfire to make such truck. But you got a gun, ain't you? We can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries and such, truck. Is that what you live on? Get nothing else." Why, how long have you been on the island, Jim? I'm here tonight after you's killed. What, all the time? Yes, indeedy. And ain't you had nothing but that rubbish to eat? No, sir, nothing else. Well, you must be most starved, ain't you? And I could eat a horse. How long you been on the island? Since the night I got killed. No, why, what has you lived on? You got a gun. Oh, yes, you got a gun. That's good. You kill something and I'll make up the fire.
When breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eating it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all his might, for he was most about starved.
How'd you come to be here, Jim? And how'd you get here?
He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says,
Maybe I better not tell. Why, Jim? There's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck? Blamed if I would, Jim. I believe you, Huck. I run off. Jim! And you said you wouldn't tell, Huck. You said you wouldn't tell.